Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Leah sent me notes, and Steve, check out the story. It's from Canada, but it's fascinating. And this kind of thing happens here all the time. Now, it depends on where you are as to how it would get resolved, and that's the interesting thing. So, Jim Bronskill wrote this story for the Canadian Press. Supreme Court of Canada sides with Toronto couple over disputed portion of their backyard. Who owns your backyard? Turns out you need the Supreme Court to decide that. The Supreme Court of Canada says a Toronto couple owns a portion of their backyard that became the subject of a lengthy dispute after they discovered that the municipality was the official title holder of the property. The two bought the residential property in 2017 and learned several years later that the city of Toronto technically held title to a part of their backyard that was enclosed inside by a chain link fence. So in other words, their backyard has a chain link fence around it. And the city, on paper, owns a portion of that which was within that chain link fence. Now, the property itself backs up to a lane owned by the municipality, which separates the property and its neighbors from a large public park. So there's a public park back there. The fence goes around their property, but technically the park comes in past the fence. So an old survey that was decades old shows that the fence was erected sometime before 1971 and possibly as early as 1958. And public access to that disputed land has been cut off for at least 54 years. So the two of them asked the city if they could buy the land just to resolve the issue. And they said, look, we've been maintaining it. Our kids been playing on it, and of course, it's fenced into our property. And the city said, no, it's not for sale. And then they indicated that the land could be recovered so that they could expand the existing access point to the park and maybe install some signage. And so, of course, that fence would have to come down. So the couple went to court seeking a declaration of possessory title to the land, sometimes known as adverse possession. And they refer to that as a quiet title action, an action to quiet title. The Ontario Superior Court ruled against the two, and then a local court of appeal also upheld that opinion. But the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, 5-4, sided with the couple. And it turns out that in Ontario, there's a law that addresses this. The Real Property Limitations Act sets out rules for determining when an owner's interest in land is extinguished in favor of the possessory title acquired by a trespasser, the top court said. Now, a trespasser here is not somebody who's violating a no trespassing sign. It's as a piece of property, and this couple thinks it's their own at first. They treat it like it's their own, and the entire time, nobody else acts like it's their own. So, elements of possession have been further defined in relevant case law over the years. Among other conditions, adverse possession is established when it is exclusive, peaceful, and continuous. So this couple, by having that fence around the property, is pretty much announcing to the world, this is our property. And the city would have had to come by years ago and say, hey, why is that fence on our land? So the statute in Ontario includes a 10-year limitation period for a title holder to bring an action for the recovery of land. So if the fence went up in 1958, the city had until like 1968 to do something. So a justice writing for a majority of the court said determining a possessory claim requires courts to ensure legislative intent is respected and to apply common law principles in a manner consistent with a statutory scheme. So the whole idea of adverse possession and acquiring title to land is a common law concept. It goes way back. A reading of the relevant provisions in the context of the broader statutory scheme governing adverse possession in Ontario reveals the legislature did not intend to exempt municipal parkland from the Real Property Limitations Act's effects, she wrote. That's extremely important. Because in Michigan, where I practice law, and I knew this before I saw this story, I actually went and pulled the statute, we'll talk about that in a second. But in Michigan, you cannot get adverse possession against the state or a municipal body. So if you're in Michigan right now going, wait a second, I have a piece of property that abuts state land. If I go and just extend my fence a little bit, I can acquire that land. Well, you can extend your fence until somebody spots it, and they can go take that fence down. It's on state land. And no, you don't acquire it. Doesn't matter how long it's there. So attempting to create a common law exception for municipal parkland undermines the legislature's clear policy choice to only confer immunity to certain categories of public land. So apparently the statute in Ontario says, here's how the law works, and it did not exempt land such as this. So the judge concluded that under the applicable statutory rules, the city's title to the land was extinguished over 4 decades ago, adding its title cannot be resurrected. So I mentioned that in Michigan and many other states, there are statutes on the books that say specifically that you cannot take land by adverse possession from the state. And the law makes sense if you think about it, because there's so much state land everywhere. The state can't be running around constantly trying to figure out if people are just, encroached a little bit onto it. And so because the way adverse possession works, in Michigan, you get 15 years. So if you have the land and you treat it like it's your own, I'm not going to go through all the elements, but you treat it like it's your own, you keep other people off it, you maintain it, it's open, it's notorious, you might even pay taxes on it, and after 15 years, it's yours. However, the records don't change on their own. You've got to bring an action to get the records changed. And so when you bring an action to get the records changed, the other side can object. And of course, if it's past a certain period of time, they can't object because the statute of limitations would have run. And so the way they deal with that in Michigan is they actually remove the statute of limitations for the state and municipal entities. So it's MCL 600.5821. 600 is our revised Judicature Act. That's where a lot of these laws reside. 600.5821. Recovery of land or public ground, an action for the recovery of any land to which the state is a party, is not subject to the periods of limitations or latches. Latches is spelled L-A-C-H-E-S here. There's no T. And latches in the legal sense is a Latin term, I believe, meaning that somebody waited too long. If you sit on your rights but don't exercise them, you can be accused of latches. Latches is a defense someone can raise and say, I understand you had a case, but not anymore. In an action involving the recovery or the possession of land, including a public highway, street, alley, easement, or other public ground, a municipal corporation, political subdivision of the state, or county road commission is not subject to any of the following: the period of limitations under the Act, latches, or a claim for adverse possession. So there you go. So you can theoretically discover that you have a piece of land that you believe you've owned for a long time. Let's say it's enclosed by a fence. Somebody put that fence in decades ago, and someone comes along and goes, according to the records at the county, a big chunk of your backyard is actually attached to the state park behind your property. And you go, well, I've had it for more than 15 years now. So you bring an action to quiet title. Now, if that was a private entity back there, you'd bring this action and you'd win. However, because the party you're bringing it against is the state, you lose. So it's an interesting case because I was under the impression that most entities out there that pass laws, i.e. governments, had written this exemption in for themselves with respect to their property. But apparently, that's not the case in Canada, at least not in Ontario. So I assure you that the lawmakers in Ontario right now are scrambling, going, maybe we should update our statute and do what those people over there in a neighbor state does, because Michigan and Ontario are actually neighbors. We're right across the river and or a lake from each other. So that's interesting. But Leah, thanks for sending that. I found this absolutely fascinating. And like I said, I was familiar with the topic before. I had a friend who had a legal issue that arose because of something like this, but the story is too complicated for now, maybe later. But from the Canadian Press, Jim Bronskill wrote that Supreme Court of Canada sides with Toronto couple over disputed portion of their backyard. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Never confuse a single defeat with a final defeat.